Hello everyone. Tonight I take you on a new journey. And this time we're going to travel along lost trails of the Andes mountains, to jungles, to deserts, to the shores of mountain lakes with crystal clear waters. For thousands of years, human cultures rose, declined, changed or disappeared in South America. Numerous cities and states expanded, leaving as many remains, and maybe some of them remain to be discovered. But as far as we know, no civilization, no empire was as successful as the Incas at expanding, building and governing a large empire that, at its height, dominated the west of South America, from Colombia in the north to Chile in the south, over thousands of miles. An empire with a wide range of climates, different peoples, different landscapes, but a single almighty emperor, the Sapa Inca, who ruled over his lands from his capital, Cusco, in modern Peru. In the 16th century, the Inca Empire was still young, and maybe it would have expanded even more. But disaster struck it. From the north, from Central America, and with ships that landed on the Pacific coast, mysterious invaders from an unknown continent arrived and brought down the empire. They were accompanied and even preceded by devastating epidemics. The empire fell into a civil war. They managed to capture the Sapa Inca, and they were helped by some of the subjugated peoples that now turned against their previous masters. The Spanish conquistadors, because it was them, were looking for conquests, treasures and glory, and they found the three, well beyond their wildest dreams. In a few years, the glorious empire of the Incas was dislocated, conquered and colonized. The majority of the former subjects of the Sapa Inca either died of unknown diseases or was enslaved. The empire was no more, and no new indigenous South American civilization would ever rise again. But this does not erase the past, and this is what we will explore tonight. From the first arrivals of human beings in South America to the rise and the fall of the Inca Empire. So please make yourself comfortable. We have a campfire to keep us warm, and everything is quiet, peaceful around us. Do not hesitate to close your eyes and let yourself go whenever you feel like it. You can always come back another time using the timestamps that are in the description box, the first comment pinned under the video, and on your screen. If this works better for you, don't forget that you can also listen to my stories on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music and other music platforms. Or on Patreon if you wish to also support this channel and get the associated perks. There are also links to these in the description and first comment. And finally, for a different take on my stories, you have two podcasts, Lights Out Library in American English and La Biblioteca de los Sueños in Spanish. Two podcasts edited and narrated by Olimpia, who does it very well. You will also find links to these. And now, take a deep breath. Let the tension go in your shoulders and the rest of your body. You can do that slowly, taking your time. We are never in a hurry around here. And now, let's get started. So, I was telling you that the Incas were the last of various civilizations in the Andes Mountains, the mountain range that stretches south to north in South America, from Chile and Argentina in the south, across Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, all the way north to Colombia. This region of the world is regarded as one of the cradles of urban civilizations. The cradles, that is to say, the places where human civilizations with cities, with a relatively high degree of complexity, arose by themselves without being derivatives from another civilization that already had acquired these characteristics. These pristine civilizations were all based on an agricultural model that produced enough food to sustain people not working in food production: administrators, priests, artisans. By definition, people who live in cities don't spend time, or not all of their time, producing or gathering food. So in order to have cities, you need food surpluses produced by others. Based on that definition of what a civilization is, there are at least 4 cradles in the Old World. In ancient China, in India, in Mesopotamia, and in Egypt. These are all places where urban civilizations arose, starting more than 5,000 years ago, and as far as we know, none of these early civilizations in these places had a precedent. And there are 2 more of these cradles in the Americas. One in Mesoamerica, roughly the south of modern Mexico, which is the place where peoples like the Olmecs, the Toltecs, the Maya, the Aztecs lived, and one in South America, centered on Peru. The oldest known civilization or urban culture in South America, and actually in all of America, is one called Caral-Supe, near the Pacific coast in the center of Peru. Its oldest archaeological remains have been dated to 5,500 years ago. And this civilization included various population centers, towns or cities, as many as 30. The main one is called Caral, and because it was the largest and most spectacular one, it gave its name to the entire culture. And it is a really impressive site despite its age, with pyramids and an elaborate urbanism. The people of the Caral-Supe civilization practiced agriculture, but it is unsure it was their main food source. It is possible, and that would be an exception among the first civilizations, that marine food, fish and shells, were an even more important resource to them. Of course, when we define civilization with criteria like cities, a writing system, an architecture, a state and its administration, a society with a hierarchy. This is a way of looking at human cultures that is not completely neutral or independent. There is a point of view. This definition was decided or formulated by scholars and archaeologists who themselves are the products, the descendants of such urban cultures. And this is not a new phenomenon. Already in antiquity, the ancient Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese judged other cultures based on what they knew, and oftentimes very harshly. But returning to the present, such a definition of what civilization is could tend to exclude from civilization some cultural traits, like the absence of writing systems, when all culture is transmitted orally, or the absence of architecture in stone, because buildings in wood or other materials that are less durable do not always leave traces. On the other hand, it is quite hard to look at ancient cultures that didn't leave any traces behind them. If they didn't leave remains that can be studied, or documents that can be read, it is very hard to even know that they existed, and there is nothing tangible to work with. It is also a fact that cultures without cities, or at least food surpluses, cannot place themselves on a path of steady technical progress, of accumulation of knowledge, generation after generation. New technical discoveries and their transmission require a specialization of a part of the population, and also a relatively large group of people, so that knowledge survives the death of any particular individual. Written documents are obviously a great plus here. Without these characteristics, without this basic prosperity, it is impossible for a human group to progress technically. And this is why there is not really an alternative definition of what civilization is. Civilization requires a large group of people sharing a common culture with a relatively complex society in which there are different roles and hierarchies. This is why urbanization, a writing system, and a list of discoveries are pertinent criteria. It is also interesting to compare these pristine civilizations around the world, because they shared traits even though they were not in contact. Their cultural and social traits tell us of how human beings adapt to necessity, to the environment, to a geography, a climate. And there are also similarities that appear spontaneously in human groups that were very distant and were never in contact. So these comparisons tell us of our capacity to adapt, and also what we have in common as a species, as social animals. So, coming back to South America, the Andes were one such laboratory or cradle of early civilization. And civilization started very quickly there, because it was also one of the last, if not the last, big region of the world to be populated by humans. It is believed that the first humans arrived by the Isthmus of Panama after they had colonized North America. And the earliest evidence of settlements in the Andean region date back from 15,000 BC, 17,000 years ago. As I told you, The first evidence of an urban civilization appeared in the 4th millennium BC, Caral-Supe in Peru. And after that, archaeology indicates that various other Andean cultures, from Colombia to Chile, lasted for centuries and declined or were absorbed by others. We are talking of several thousands of years before the Incas even appeared as a state. But during this time, probably due to distances and an absence of contacts with other continents, Andean civilizations or Andean cultures maintained particular traits that made them unique in the world. So, what are these traits? First, as far as we know, none of them ever developed a written language, but instead, they used a way of conveying information called the quipu. A quipu consists of a main string to which more strings, more cords are attached, in different colors and with knots. Quipus can be of different sizes. The word quipu means knot in most varieties of Quechua. Quechua is the family of languages that was and remains spoken in and around Peru. So a quipu could have only a few cords, or up to thousands, in which case it could contain as much information as a book. So quipus were a way of encoding numeric information, collecting data, keeping records, keeping track of the calendar, or for military organization or taxes. The cultures that used them could give different meanings to the colors, the knots, and the distance between the knots, because a quipu is an object or a method to convey information, like a book can be. It is not a language. And actually the knowledge of reading them disappeared during colonial times in the Andes. So the information in the few ancient surviving quipus that we still have can no longer be read. It has been argued, but this is controversial, that quipus were more than that, and were actually a written language in its own right. This was never formally proven, but it was observed that some patterns of knots and colors could have been used to designate places, or possibly names of people, or even dates. This could suggest that the system would have been used as a kind of writing system, one in which colors, knots, and distances between knots would have replaced the symbols, the alphabet or ideograms and pictograms that we are familiar with in other writing systems. But there is no definitive proof of this. It seems the knowledge necessary to read quipus was always limited to a small minority of people. Maybe because the information enclosed in them was strategic, important. It certainly was in the Inca Empire, where very few people, apparently, could decipher a quipu. So this probably also made the disappearance of this knowledge easier. Apart from this original system to store information, Andean civilizations had other specificities. Another one was the absence of wheeled vehicles. They never used the wheel to make chariots or wheelbarrows. This is surprising because This type of vehicles appeared relatively early in civilizations of the Old World. These are cheap and efficient ways of improving productivity and transporting things. Of course, many Andean cultures lived in mountains where the use of wheeled vehicles was not always viable. But not all of them. There are also deserts or plateaus that are flat. So a better reason maybe for this absence of wheels could be the absence of draft animals. There were no horses or camels or cattle in the region, and this didn't leave many options. The llama was the domesticated animal that came closest to a horse. But llamas are not that strong. They can only carry about a fourth of their weight, a maximum of 100 pounds. And so they were not big or strong enough to be used for plowing or as riding animals. So the transportation of goods was made only by foot, with llamas carrying up to their 100 pounds on their backs, or by people. Yet another original trait of these cultures was the absence of money and markets where to buy things. We don't exactly know how their economies worked. This is still debated. But a major difference with others is that no coins or places for trade could ever be found in their ruins, contrary to civilizations of the Old World. So between the absence of currency and of physical places where to trade, it seems the economy was organized on reciprocity and redistribution, maybe at the scale of a community, a village, a city, or even a state. Things were put in common and shared between individuals or families, based on an unknown allocation system. Not necessarily an equalitarian distribution of resources. Maybe it was between people of the same social standing. But these Andean societies also had very fierce hierarchies. There was an elite of nobles and a mass of common people, and they really didn't have the same means or status. And here again, this was a trait present in the Inca Empire, but that had originated in much earlier times. To conclude that list of specificities, I could mention one last aspect. Of all the cradles of civilizations, the Andean one is probably the one with the most natural challenges to deal with. When you compare it to others, especially in the Old World, you see that the regions where urban civilizations flourished had a warm climate, but not too warm, fertile land, if you think about Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus Valley. They had a relatively flat and abundant arable land. These were all positive factors for agricultural surpluses to appear. In comparison, Andean peoples were not dealt a very good hand. The Andean environment is more challenging. The first known civilization I mentioned earlier, Caral-Supe, appeared on the coast of Peru in a desert that was very arid and where only irrigation made agriculture possible. The same in valleys crossed by rivers coming from the Andes. There is a lot of water because glaciers store it in the mountains and release it in warmer seasons. But these rivers, flowing in valleys and straight to the Pacific Ocean in a few hundred miles at most, are very different from the slow and large rivers of ancient China, India, or the Middle East. So water had to be retained to irrigate fields. And there is also a scarcity of flat lands in the Andes. As soon as you start climbing, and above 10,000 feet, that's 3,000 meters, the temperature becomes very cool. It can freeze at night at any time of the year. Many areas of the Andes are also very dry. It rarely rains. And soils are thin, which is another bad factor for agriculture. And yet, these ancient cultures often appeared in the mountains, where the conditions were some of the harshest. They came up with solutions like terraces for agriculture, irrigation, warm clothing, the optimization of every possible resource, and actually the kind of redistributive economy that seems to dominate in these cultures may have been a consequence of these harsh conditions. The deep understanding that survival was difficult and depended on society as a whole may have prevented more individualistic conceptions of life from emerging. It has been supposed as a hypothesis that this kind of phenomenon also appeared in parts of Asia, like in Japan or some regions of China, and contributed to shape societies and individuals' psychologies. In any case, a remarkable trait of these ancient Andean cultures is their capacity to adapt and make the most of objectively harsh conditions. So as you see, they had their unique traits, from the absence of a writing system as we generally understand it, to these adaptation skills or the absence of cattle or horses. And yet, like in other cradles of civilization, they discovered a lot of essential techniques: pottery, weaving and textile, metallurgy, even though pre-Columbian cultures in America stayed in the Bronze Age. They never smelted iron, and they discovered iron tools and weapons when the Spaniards arrived. And apart from techniques, these people elaborated complex societies and states, with a particularly efficient administration. We'll see that when I tell you about the Inca Empire. They acquired a good understanding of astronomy, something common to many pre-Columbian civilizations, a rich and diversified production of crafts and art pieces. They perfected their agriculture, and so even without wheeled vehicles or iron tools, these were really advanced cultures for their time. Apart from Caral-Supe, which I already mentioned, other major ancient Andean civilizations include the Valdivia culture in modern-day Ecuador, another coastal settled culture that flourished almost at the same time, between the 4th and the 2nd millennia BC. There was also the Chavin culture in the Peruvian highlands in the 1st millennium BC. This one was contemporary to classical Greece. In the 1st millennium AD, there was the Nazca culture, also in Peru, famous for these large lines that they created that represent giant animals seen from the sky. And also in the 1st millennium, as the Roman Empire rose and fell, and Europe entered the Dark Ages, other cultures appeared like Moche, Chachapoyas, or the Wari and Tiwanaku empires, early precursors to the Inca Empire. Some of these cultures were from the Pacific coast, some from the mountains, and some even on the other side of the Andes. The Chachapoyas, for example, lived in cloud forests to the west of the Amazonian forest, in the northeast of Peru. And in the second millennium, in the centuries prior to the colonial conquest, plenty of different kingdoms, chiefdoms, or federations sharing similar cultures and languages kept appearing, like the Muisca in Colombia, the Chimu in the north of Peru, the Aymara kingdoms in Bolivia that replaced this Tiwanaku empire I mentioned earlier. And I'm only listing some of the most famous, there were many more. These states had one or several urban centers, and some of them expanded, subjugating other peoples or forming federations with peoples who wanted to join them. This is what the Tiwanaku Empire did. It originated from the Altiplano, the second largest high plateau in the world after Tibet. It is mostly in modern Bolivia, but there are bits in Peru and Chile. Even though it is called an empire and it did expand well beyond its base, with either colonies or settlements that imitated it, it is unsure Tiwanaku was a state with an army and one or several ruling dynasties. It could have been more like a kind of federation of people, because even though Tiwanaku left considerable buildings, a famous one is the Gateway of the Sun, a monumental stone gate. So Tiwanaku left buildings, but contrary to what one may expect, with no signs of defensive structures, and also not much weaponry based on archaeological finds. So this suggests that Tiwanaku could have been more of a cultural and a religious area rather than a kingdom. Little is known about it, but what is certain is that in the centuries prior to the emergence of the Inca Empire, Tiwanaku occupied or covered the region where the Incas would emerge. And so it had a big cultural influence on them. At the same time as Tiwanaku, another formation to the northwest was the Wari Empire. Here again, it is called empire, but it could well have been a political formation of uncertain nature, or maybe just a network of towns and villages sharing the same culture, we don't know. The Wari lasted a bit longer and also influenced the future Incas. The early history of the Incas is full of question marks, because there is no written documents that we would know of, and so the only elements that helped recreate it are archaeology and the oral tradition that existed in the 16th century at the time of the conquest and was collected, probably imperfectly, and at a time when the line between history and myth was not very clear. But still, the main lines of this history could be established with a good level of certainty. So, once the Tiwanaku and Wari empires dislocated, they were replaced in the 12th century by a collection of small kingdoms. I mentioned these Aymara kingdoms of the Altiplano earlier that succeeded Tiwanaku. So the south of Peru and west of Bolivia were covered by numerous small states and independent tribes. The Inca people were one of them. The legend says that in the early 13th century, the Incas were ruled by a man called Manco Capac, and he would have been the founder of the Inca civilization. In reality, Manco Capac could very well have existed, but it is uncertain, because he is known mainly through legends, chronicles that retell the foundation of what would become an empire. Apart from that, there is no tangible proof that he existed. But in any case, the first Incas formed a small kingdom, a small city-state, like there were many at the time in the area, in the city of Cusco. And for about 200 years, this little kingdom, ruled by kings, existed and prospered before it became the seat of the Inca Empire. But it is time to do a bit of etymology. We speak of Inca Empire, or the Incas, but this was not how these people called themselves. The Incas referred to their empire as Tawantinsuyu, a word from Quechua that means the quartet or the group of 4 provinces. In Quechua, Tawa means 4, and Ntin is a suffix that names a group. So Tawantin means a group of 4 things or 4 elements taken together. And Suyu is a region or a province. So Tawantinsuyu is a quartet of provinces, the 4 provinces of the Inca Empire that met at the capital. But Inca is originally not the name of a people. It means ruler or lord in Quechua. And centuries ago, the term Inca was probably understood with a broader sense. It also included the nobles that ruled over the mass of the population. So the term Inca named a small elite of rulers, the masters. It is only in modern times that the Incas became the name of the people as a whole, the people that populated the Inca Empire. The emperors, and before them the kings of Cusco, were called Sapa Inca. Sapa means the only one, so we could translate this title by supreme or unique ruler. I told you before that Inca society had a hierarchy. At its peak, its population could have reached about 10 to 12 million people, spread along the Andes from Ecuador to Chile. But the number of nobles, people that governed locally or from the court of the emperor in Cusco, this number has been estimated between 15,000 and 40,000, less than 0.5% of the population. So the Incas, the rulers, were certainly a small group. With these numbers, there would have been about 300 common people for one noble. For comparison, the number of nobles in European medieval societies was estimated to between 1 and 3% of the population, depending on the countries and the periods. It could vary a lot. For example, in the 18th century, well after the Middle Ages, there were kingdoms like Poland or Castile where the noble population could surpass 10% of the whole population. but at the same time, it was 2 to 3% in Russia, 1% in France, and less than 1% in Sweden. But still, this Inca nobility, this aristocracy, when you compare it with other societies, was really a small and exclusive group. And we can suppose from it that they lived with a degree of power and material comfort that was remarkable. So, returning to the Kingdom of Cusco, for about 200 years, and under 8 different kings or 8 different Sapa Inca, they started calling themselves like this by the mid-14th century. The kingdom remained relatively small, and apart from the succession of monarchs, we don't really know much about its political life or possible conflicts with neighbors. Information is limited, and like for the figure of Manco Capac, history and legend are too intertwined to really know what happened. But this all changed with the 9th Sapa Inca of the Kingdom of Cusco, Pachacuti. At the time of his accession, it seems the Kingdom of Cusco was still not impressive at all. Cusco itself was a village with a royal house and a few other buildings, but it was not spectacular at all, and many kingdoms of Peru and the Altiplano were probably larger and wealthier. But Pachacuti turned out to be an expansionist king and a conqueror, and his reign lasted 33 years, from 1438 to 1471. He was the sole ruler from 1438 to 1463 for 25 years, after which power was shared, waiting for the accession of his successor. 1438, the beginning of Pachacuti's reign, was the starting point of Inca expansion. And you see that we were just 54 years before Columbus' journey to America, and 80 years before the conquest of Mexico by the Spanish against the Aztecs. This is actually the time window during which the Inca Empire rose. So, first in 3 decades, with a mix of military campaigns and diplomacy, Pachacuti enlarged the Kingdom of Cusco in every direction. He created a larger kingdom of the mountains by following the Andes to the north and south of Cusco. It is widely admitted that Machu Picchu, a retreat or family home for emperors, of which I will tell you more in detail later, was built for him. As Pachacuti aged, he named one of his sons, Tupac, as a co-ruler and successor. And Tupac continued the conquest with even more success. Tupac focused on the north and conquered all the west of Peru and Ecuador, all the way north to what is now the frontier between Ecuador and Colombia. And after his father's death in 1471, he focused on the south for 20 years, annexing the entire Altiplano and the northern half of Chile, plus bits of what is now Argentina on the other side of the Andes. But what made the Incas so successful at expanding like this? Not only farther than any Andean civilization that preceded them, but so much faster. Among explanations, one that often comes back is their economy, or their productive capacity. I already told you that ancient Andean economies seemed to ignore currencies and relied on communal production. The Incas had such a system, but they were very efficient at centralizing and managing production. This meant more food surpluses, and so more men available, bigger armies, and better equipment than any of their neighbors. Actually, many of their conquests at the times of Pachacuti and Tupac were diplomatic rather than military. They sent emissaries to their neighbors with gifts for the local nobles and offered them to join the Inca state. They would be better off because they would themselves join the Inca elite and benefit from the Sapa Incas' protection and highly efficient administration. As time passed, infrastructure such as roads were added to the list of advantages. So it made sense to just pledge allegiance and join the empire. That was the carrot. If they refused, there was the stick too, which was an invasion, and if they lost, they would be executed. Once the Inca Empire had acquired a critical mass of population and armies, by the reign of Tupac, it made a lot of sense to just comply with it. And this explains for a part the very fast expansion of the empire in the second half of the 15th century. It had just become irresistible. Still, there were wars with some of its neighbors, especially as the frontiers were pushed farther and farther from Cusco. For example, a large conflict that the Incas won eventually erupted with the Empire of Chimu, another empire that stretched along the coast of Peru. To the south, they were stopped by a defeat in central Chile against the local Mapuche natives, who populated the south and center of Chile and also lived in the west of Argentina. So there were fights, battles, and occasionally setbacks. But for the rest of the 15th century, the expansion still looked very quick, and the Incas never surrendered any land that they had previously conquered to anyone. Yet another explanation to the fast rise of the Incas could be a small climate shift that took place in the 15th century. Temperatures became slightly warmer in southern Peru, and precipitations increased. This opened up vast lands in the mountains for agriculture, lands that could not be cultivated before. The Incas had already mastered this type of mountain agriculture with terraces, little soil, and harsh conditions, so they could make the best of these new conditions. And the boost in food and arable land could have also helped their expansion. So, by the end of the reign of Tupac in 1493, at this point Columbus had recently landed in the Caribbean. But no one knew that in the Inca Empire, and the empire now stretched along the Andes on thousands of miles. It had an estimated 10 to 12 million inhabitants. For comparison, Spain, around 1500, had an estimated population of 6.5 million. Great Britain, 2.5 million. This population put the Inca Empire in 7th position worldwide, population-wise, right behind the Ottoman Empire, but ahead of the Aztec Empire, which had an estimated 6 million inhabitants. with such a size, and even more with such a quick conquest, the empire had become an amalgamation of different peoples, cultures, and languages. It takes time to integrate different peoples into a single state. And the Inca elite seems to have been very aware of the need to further integrate, to assimilate peoples into this original north-south empire that followed a mountain range over thousands of miles. Roads were built, entire populations were moved around the empire, typically when a new people was conquered or integrated within the boundaries of the Inca Empire. They would be sent to a completely different region. This was a way of cutting people from their culture and their attachment to a particular land, and ensuring that they would be more loyal. After a generation or two, their old culture would have been forgotten and replaced with Inca culture. But still, the conquest had been very quick. It was still fresh when the Spanish arrived, and in regions that were far away from Cusco, the loyalty of the local nobles and more generally the subjects of the Incas was still questionable. We already talked a bit about these cultural traits that were common to all Andean civilizations, of which the Incas are a part of. But apart from that, what was Inca society like? First, I gave you estimates of the population of around 10 to 12 million. But these have to be taken with caution. Actually, the Incas probably knew quite well how many subjects populated each of their 4 provinces. Their administration was very developed, and records of everything were kept on quipus. But most quipus were lost, and the knowledge necessary to read them disappeared, so we ignore the numbers they contained. Estimates of the population of the Inca Empire at its peak range from 4 to 36 million inhabitants. The very low or very high estimates are often considered little credible because they have generally political motivations, such as to say that the colonizers barely murdered anyone, or the opposite, that they committed massacres or indirectly killed tens of millions in the Andes due to war, the diseases and forced labor. To be clear, all of these things did happen with colonization, but it doesn't mean the numbers have to be exaggerated. Almost all estimates regarded as serious by historians fall within a range from 6 to 14 million people. And the vast majority of them worked to produce food and crafts. And as we saw before, everything was centralized when it came to production. So people would give their labor to the state, and all their basic needs, clothing or food, were given to them in exchange. Communities also had to pay a tribute in nature: grain, meat, wool, clothes. In nature, because there were no coins, and precious metals like silver and gold were used to make ornaments or jewelry, but not as currency. The centralization of resources also permitted the empire to redistribute when harvests were bad in a region. And so being part of the empire was a kind of insurance against famines. in ancient societies, and that was still true all around the world in the 15th and 16th centuries. The food supply was always a big concern. Even when there were good years and people could stock up, 2 or 3 consecutive years of bad harvests were enough to start a famine anywhere. So, a state that could make food come from hundreds of miles away and offered protection against hunger was a blessing for these communities. What did they eat, by the way? A quite wide variety of crops were cultivated. Some were natives to the Americas, and they were exported later after the colonial conquest, like potatoes, tomatoes, or corn. They also had peanuts and different vegetables, different fruits, and pseudo-grains like quinoa too. A pseudo-grain, or pseudo-cereal, is a plant that is not a grass like cereals, but is used very much the same way. So people of the Andes didn't have wheat or rice, but they had quinoa and another pseudo-cereal called amaranth. For ordinary people, the diet was mostly plant-based, and it was complemented with fish near the coastlines and meat from guinea pigs and llamas in particular, which were raised for their wool and their meat. There is a lot to say about Inca architecture, agriculture, government, or religion, so I will go through these aspects after, in the stories about Machu Picchu and the Plomo boy. Returning to the history of the empire, by the years 1520, the empire had reached its peak in terms of expansion under Emperor Huayna Capac, who added more territory to the north. But a deadly threat was coming from the north: the Spanish conquistadors. Between 1519 and 1521, the Spanish, led by Hernán Cortés, had brought down the Aztec Empire in Mexico. In the 1520s, explorations through Central America detected the existence of yet another large and wealthy empire, to the south this time, and actually larger, more populated, and probably even wealthier than the Aztecs. They had reached Inca territory by 1526, and with them, involuntarily, they had brought pathogens, new diseases. And these diseases, even before a war started with the Spaniards, began to put the Inca Empire to its knees. You know that well ahead of wars, a major cause of mortality among pre-Columbian populations in America was the introduction of pathogens that were unknown on the continent, meaning people from North or South America had no pre-existing immune defenses against them. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, typhus, measles. We don't know how many subjects of the Incas this first wave of diseases killed, but it certainly disorganized the empire. It made different peoples and nobles realize that they may have an opportunity to recover their independence. And smallpox even killed the Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, together with his designated heir, triggering a succession war. As this was happening, a Spanish conquistador called Francisco Pizarro had traveled back to Spain and obtained royal approval in 1529 to conquer the Incas and govern this new land that the Spanish now called New Castile or Peru. The conquest of Mexico had been one of the most, maybe even the most immediately profitable expedition in history. A small group of men, aided by their advanced equipment and the political situation with different peoples ready to revolt against the Aztecs, and also a lot of luck, had been able to send back inconceivable treasures to Spain, a mountain of gold and other treasures. So they now hoped the same operation could be repeated with the Incas, and it would be repeated indeed. Pizarro had been given the green light in Spain in 1529 to invade the Incas. In 1532, he was back to South America, and he entered Inca territory with a modest force of 168 men, 27 horses, and only one cannon. That is to say, almost nothing to conquer an empire, even with the technological advantage of gunpowder or steel armor. But once again, the conquistadors were very lucky. Following the death of the Sapa Inca, Huayna Capac, I told you that a succession war had begun. Two of his sons had started this war, Huáscar and Atahualpa. In this chaos, unrest had surged in conquered provinces far from Cusco, and the epidemic was still taking its toll on the empire. The forces of Pizarro only engaged minor garrisons in present-day Ecuador to the north of the Inca Empire, and nothing special was done to stop them because the two pretenders were too busy fighting each other. A fight that finally Atahualpa won, and as he was resting near the city of Cajamarca in the north of Peru, with an army of 80,000 men, that's 500 to 1 against the Spanish, he invited Pizarro for talks. To the Incas, it was just unthinkable that anything could happen to their emperor. He was sacred, chosen by the gods, and more tangibly, he was surrounded by an army of 80,000 men. So the idea that a few dozen conquistadors would try anything probably did not even cross their minds. But the Spanish did try something. They met with Atahualpa, and on the first occasion they attacked the Inca forces around, who were mostly unarmed. They captured the emperor, and with their emperor prisoner, the Inca soldiers, completely disoriented, obeyed orders to stop fighting. For the price of his liberty, Atahualpa was asked to fill a room from floor to ceiling with gold, and also bring twice that amount of silver, which he did. But they still didn't release him, and finally he was executed in 1533. As the emperor was now prisoner, and the prestige of the empire had taken a huge hit, many regional leaders just rejected the Sapa Inca and turned to the Spanish for allegiance. They switched overlords. And this helped the Spanish enormously, helped them dismantle and take control of the Inca Empire, which collapsed like a house of cards. For the peoples that had lived under Inca rule, this change of overlords was certainly not positive. At best, they kept living about the same, under a noble that now obeyed the Spanish. These nobles were called encomenderos. This was a system in which they managed an area and its inhabitants on behalf of the colonizers, to whom they paid taxes. For ordinary people, it meant more work, and now there were the epidemics ravaging the Andean region on a regular basis. I told you it had begun in the 1520s with smallpox. In the 1540s, there was typhus. In the 1550s, influenza and smallpox again. These epidemics kept happening for about a century. They lasted into the 17th century, with more smallpox outbreaks, diphtheria, and measles. This, plus forced labor in mines and agriculture, made the indigenous population decrease dramatically along the 16th century. And even though the Spanish rule was imposed from Colombia to Chile, there were periodic attempts to revolt and expel the Spanish until the late 18th century, but all these rebellions were crushed. The memory and the physical remains of Inca cities did not disappear, obviously. Some, like Cusco, remain populated to this day, and this is why in numerous cities of Peru you can find archaeological remains. Sometimes the foundations of buildings date back from the Inca period. All the languages that were spoken across the Inca Empire declined, as Spanish replaced them, and some disappeared, but among native populations of Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia, some are still spoken, in particular Quechua, this family of languages that nowadays has about 7 million native speakers, half of them from Peru, and most of the others from Ecuador and Bolivia. As a way of shedding a different light to the history of the Incas, I am adding 2 fragments from past stories. One about Machu Picchu, the lost city that is also a jewel of Inca architecture, and the other one about the Plomo boy, or El Niño del Cerro el Plomo, the mummified body of a young boy who was sacrificed after an elaborate ritual, and that I commented on as a part of the visit of the National Natural History Museum in Santiago, Chile. It is a site you probably have seen pictures of, in the mountains to the south of Peru, near a peak, between the grey of rocks, the green of the jungle, and the blue of the sky. There are the remains of a small city or a large estate where emperors of the Inca Empire sometimes resided. It is 50 miles away from the capital of the Inca Empire, Cusco, a city that still exists. And Machu Picchu is not the largest nor the oldest of Inca ruins, but it is certainly the most famous because of its beauty, because of its relevance as an imperial estate, and also the story of its rediscovery. It was actually never completely lost. The site was abandoned, but people who lived near it knew it existed under the jungle that had covered it. But it didn't attract much interest from archaeologists until the 20th century. But first, to understand what Machu Picchu is about, we need to talk about the rise and fall of the Incas. In pre-Columbian America, the Inca Empire was the largest state in the early 16th century, when the Spaniards started conquering and colonizing the continent. The conquest of the Incas started in 1532, after the Spaniards had well established their domination to the north in Mexico. And 40 years later, the last Inca stronghold fell. This empire extended along the Andes Mountains and along the Pacific coast of South America, on thousands of miles, from what is now Ecuador to the north of Chile, and its heart corresponded to modern Peru. But the Incas were just the last, and probably the most successful at conquering others, of many civilizations or cultures that had appeared in this part of the world, starting several thousand years earlier, several thousand years before our era. The Incas were a people that lived in the highlands of Peru, and sometime in the 13th century, so less than 300 years before Columbus reached America, they started expanding from there. They fixed their capital in Cusco, and they conquered, by war and diplomacy, a lot of other peoples to the north and the south over several generations. They reached their peak at the beginning of the 16th century, just when the Spanish conquest began. Maybe they could have expanded even further and kept progressing if this process had not been interrupted. And because they were cut geographically from Asia, Europe, or Africa, they followed a particular path to civilization. They had discovered or inherited all the basic technical know-how that made them a rather advanced civilization. They used pottery, weaving, metallurgy. They had cities, an elaborate architecture and urbanism, and administration, and in some fields, like agriculture or medicine, they were quite advanced for the time. On the other hand, they didn't use iron. They still lived in the Bronze Age. They didn't use the wheel to transport things or to farm. They didn't have a writing system. There are no Inca texts from before the Spanish conquest, contrary to the documents produced by pre-Columbian cultures in Central America and in Mexico. They kept records and they communicated remotely using quipus, which were knotted strings. But still, they were very skilled builders. They had built or expanded a large road network that reached all corners of their empire. They produced very refined crafts, and they managed to occupy very different regions, not just mountains and highlands of the Andes. They also ruled over deserts, coastlines, and jungles. And because they annexed regions that were quite far apart, there were many languages practiced around the empire. What unified it was its administration, which was very centralized, and it seems they did not hesitate to move entire groups of people around from one corner of the empire to another, so that they would populate regions that they wanted to see populated, and these people would lose their cultural identity to become only subjects of the emperor. there was also a large army, and the figure of the Sapa Inca, the emperor, who was considered as a divine being, and not only head of state but also head of the state religion. This figure was also an element that unified this large state. The emperor, the Sapa Inca, claimed descent from Inti, the sun god, and the patron of the Inca state. A common belief was that Inti, the sun, was born from the creator god Viracocha, and as descendants of Inti, the Inca emperors were directly connected to the creation of the world. And so nothing was too good for the Sapa Inca. This is how the building of Machu Picchu should be looked at. Most archaeologists believe that it was an estate, a residence, built for emperors at the time of Emperor Pachacuti. Pachacuti was an important figure of the Inca dynasty because he expanded the empire and actually transformed the Kingdom of Cusco, which he ruled at the beginning of his reign, into the Inca Empire. At the time, just a few decades before the Spaniards arrived, the Incas were very fastly expanding. The population within their frontiers was soaring. The devotion to the emperor was probably extraordinary. And even though Cusco remained the capital, the emperor had this residence, this retreat built for him 50 miles away from Cusco. There is no sign that the site was inhabited before, and so it makes it also very interesting because it was built over just a few decades in pure Inca style, with the monumental architecture, with terraces for cultivation that showcase all the knowledge and know-how of the Incas for mountain agriculture, and their typical polished dry stone walls, that is to say, walls made of cut rocks, rocks of different sizes that are perfectly adjusted. Machu Picchu was used for approximately 80 years because it had to be abandoned due to the Spanish conquest and a civil war that was making the Inca Empire crumble. It is unknown what happened to the residents. They may have fled or died from diseases such as smallpox that the invaders had introduced in America. Conquistadors and then other Europeans arrived in Inca cities, and so they were mapped and sometimes transformed, but not to Machu Picchu, probably because it was remote and was abandoned without resistance, so there was no trace that Europeans even went there before the 19th century, more than 400 years later. And this is why the site is sometimes called a lost city. It was completely forgotten, including by the descendants of the Incas, not entirely lost, because people who lived in villages nearby, a few miles away from the site, knew it existed, but for the rest of the world, Machu Picchu was completely unknown. So, what was life like at Machu Picchu at the time of its splendor? It seems it was occupied by the emperor seasonally, like a kind of summer palace. When the emperor was present, there would have been about 750 people living there, probably his family, plus guards and hundreds of support staff, probably a few priests too. because Machu Picchu was rather remote, many things were produced directly there, like food. There were terraces for agriculture, animals like llamas and alpacas for their pelts and meat consumption, a few dogs. The terraces were quite elaborate. In a mountainous environment, it is hard to grow crops. The ground is not flat. So the Incas mastered the building of terraces to grow food and correctly irrigate their crops. In the case of Machu Picchu, there was an abundance of rain. So the problem was not really to bring water to the terraces, but rather to drain it correctly. And for this reason, the terraces were built in several layers. They put large stones at the bottom, then gravel, then sand, and on top of that, rich soil taken from the valley below. This way, excess water fell down and was evacuated progressively, because it could trickle down slowly through the different layers instead of stagnating or running down all at once. Exploration of the site suggests that there was not enough cultivation space to feed the hundreds of residents. So part of the food was probably brought from the valleys nearby, but potatoes or corn were grown on the site. These terraces surround the most spectacular part, which is the buildings. There are approximately 200 spread over the terrain with plenty of different levels. Many stairways allowed access to the different levels across the site. A part of the site is called the popular or residential district, the place where the lower class people lived. They had simple houses, and this section contains storage buildings too. And then there was an area for noble houses and a royal palace. Separated from these residences were also several temples or structures of a religious nature. These include a temple of the sun. It is known to be one because similar buildings that were temples of the sun were found in Inca cities, including in Cusco. The temple has a kind of half tower, like a semicircular enclosure that remained open on one side and is typical of classical Inca architecture. The windows were apparently not placed randomly. One of them, which is called the solstice window, was aligned with the rising sun on solstice days. Not anymore, but where the 15th century sun rose. This kind of alignment that reveals the knowledge of astronomy and the seasonal position of celestial bodies can be found in many other parts of Machu Picchu. Another example is the Intihuatana stone that could have been an astronomical clock or a calendar. There are many other similar stones that were found across the Inca Empire. They were arranged to point directly at the sun during the winter solstice, and it is believed that rituals took place near them. One hypothesis is that the Incas believed that these stones were necessary to hold the sun in its place along its annual path in the sky. They would not have been just instruments to measure its position, but also like anchors that kept the world in order. Yet another important place at Machu Picchu is a cave called the Inti Machai. This cave was used to observe the sun on the December solstice, the winter solstice. Every year, the Incas celebrated a festival in December called the Royal Feast of the Sun. The celebration began early in the month and it ended on the day of the solstice. On this day, boys were initiated into manhood, and it is believed that noble boys had this ceremony organized for them at the Inti Machai. They stood inside the cave and watched the sunrise through a kind of tunnel window that had been aligned in such a way that the sunlight could cross it and illuminate the cave only a few days each year, around the December solstice. How Machu Picchu was built is also not known precisely. It required thousands and thousands of cut stones that were perfectly adjusted to make the walls. The Incas knew various building techniques. They also knew adobe, and they had access to a variety of building materials. So why not use mortar? Like in other civilizations, stone was more prestigious and probably seen as more aesthetical. It was also more durable. A lot of Inca monuments have crossed the centuries almost unchanged, at least for their stone parts. And another advantage of dry stone and the tight adjustment of blocks of rock is that it can resist earthquakes. The entire empire was in a seismic region, and that shows in their architecture. Adjusted stones without mortar are good at stabilizing buildings when the earth moves, and also doors and windows were often trapezoidal, narrowing from bottom to top, which gave them more stability. The walls too had various stabilizing features. On the outside, corners were often tied together with L-shaped blocks. And thanks to all these features, many Inca buildings have crossed the centuries in a good state. But in any case, bringing the blocks and cutting them was a huge work. The blocks probably didn't come from very far, but they still had to be carried along a trail all the way up to Machu Picchu. I told you earlier that the Incas didn't use the wheel. Not that they didn't know it. Toys with wheels were found, but they apparently never made chariots or wagons, and this is attributed to the lack of draft animals. They had no horses or cows or equivalent, and possibly also due to the topography. Even though their empire expanded beyond the mountains, their culture came from highlands and a mountainous environment, where the use of wheels made less sense than in plains, for example. So the stones were probably pushed to the side by hundreds of men over several years. For a few years, the region of Cusco, which included Machu Picchu, was disputed between what remained of the Inca state and the Spaniards. The Spaniards were very few, and they had a hard time controlling the entire region. When their invasion began, the empire collapsed very quickly. It was dismantled in only a few years, but it survived as a state for almost 30 years, until 1572. The son of the emperor, who was on the throne just before the arrival of the invaders, Huayna Capac, established a small state in the southeast of Peru, which is called the Neo-Inca state. This emperor, Manco Inca Yupanqui, had been placed on the throne before by the Spaniards as a puppet emperor because they needed the Inca administration to control all these lands. But he revolted against them and could make his dynasty survive for a little longer. In the years 1540s to 1560s, the Spaniards reinforced their grip on what is now Ecuador and Peru, and finally the last ruler of this Neo-Inca state, Tupac was captured and executed in 1572, effectively ending the Inca state. Machu Picchu had already been abandoned at the time, but since it was remote and in an area with few inhabitants, it was mostly forgotten and soon hidden under vegetation. It is only more than 300 years later that archaeologists found the site, and they started to realize its importance. They were stunned by its beauty, too, and in the 20th century, it turned into an icon of the Inca civilization. Another precious relic kept at the museum is the Plomo mummy, also known as Boy of El Plomo, El Niño del Cerro El Plomo. This is one of the most valuable Inca relics in the world. And we are looking at an exact replica, not the original, which is kept here in the museum, but in closely monitored conditions of humidity and temperature. Another reason to not expose the original to the public is that these are the remains of a human being, and in past decades, museums have paid more and more attention to avoid the display of dead bodies out of respect. There may be important archaeological discoveries, but they are still human bodies. This boy was not intentionally mummified. He became a natural mummy because he died in altitude, where the air is dry and cold, which froze-dried his body, a process also known as lyophilization. The corpse was frozen due to the cold and desiccated, which preserved it perfectly for centuries, until it was discovered in 1954 near Santiago on a mountain. But rather than the preservation process, the interest here is archaeological. He was an Incan boy. Santiago is located in the central part of Chile, and the central part of Chile corresponded to the southern end of the Inca Empire. You know that the heart of the Inca Empire was in Peru, the region of Cusco, from where they expanded, subjugating peoples along the Andes Mountains, far north and far south. They stopped their expansion in the middle of Chile, south of Santiago, due to the distance, the resistance of the peoples who lived south of the frontier, especially the Mapuche people that we will talk about later. And also because of the arrival of Spanish conquistadors, which made their empire collapse at a time when it was still young and on the rise. Maybe they would have expanded further, if not for the colonization process. We'll never know. So this mummy takes us at the time of the Middle Ages in Europe. Santiago was a few dozen miles north of the southern frontier of the Inca Empire. And this mummy is of particular importance because it testifies of ritual child sacrifices, an Inca ritual called capacocha. The Incas did not practice human sacrifice on a very large scale. Nothing to see with other pre-Columbian cultures from Mesoamerica, like the Aztecs. But regularly, they had highly ritualized practices that led to the sacrifice of children as an offering to the gods. The capacocha was one of the most important rituals in their calendar. It was dedicated to Viracocha, which could be described as a creator god. And this event took place between April and July, starting in the 13th century and until the early 16th century. From the four directions of the empire, people sent one or more kids to the capital, to Cusco, boys and girls that were considered beautiful and healthy. Many of them were sons of local chiefs, because offering a child was regarded as an honor, and probably also as a sign of allegiance. There may have been a political significance. The children traveled to Cusco, the symbolic center of the Inca universe, with an escort of priests, and once arrived, they participated in lengthy ceremonies and rituals involving dances, offerings, animal sacrifices. And along these ceremonies, the children were sanctified like sons of the sun, equivalent to the emperor, the Inca himself. They received presents worthy of their new status, and they were symbolically married between them. Finally, when all these rituals were over, all the kids were sent back to where they came from. But instead of using Inca roads, like the roads they had used to arrive, they had to travel in straight lines, whatever the obstacles, rivers, mountains, or valleys. And as they traveled on foot, the return trip could take months. The Plomo boy had to travel almost 2,000 miles, 3,000 kilometers, to cover the distance to and back from Cusco. Once they had arrived to their destination, there were local festivities, and the kids were taken to a high place. The study of this mummy and others suggest that they were numbed with alcohol or coca leaves. They were clothed and prepared with great care. And in this state of near unconsciousness, they were abandoned, buried to die from the cold, or briefly executed. The sacrifice had taken place. The exceptional thing with this relic is that the boy's body was frozen dried as it was. In his case, it seems he just died from the cold, numbed by chicha, a kind of beer made with corn. He fell asleep and never woke up. And then centuries passed, and he was found, buried in a chamber that had never been violated. A chamber, a tomb, from which he could have had a spectacular view on the valley where Santiago is now built. and the way it is displayed here recreates the perspective with the mountains. The boy's clothes, the offerings, the way his hair was carefully arranged, the feathers, the ornaments, all of this testifies of the care people put in this ritual. It can sound cruel to us, but it was of deep significance for the subjects of the Inca. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. As always, I hope you liked it, and I will be back soon with a new one. In the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.